Hello everybody, welcome back to my channel. Today I'm going to be sharing my editing process. Keyword my editing process, because a different editing routine is going to work for every person. Every book needs a different like amount of editing, and all of that blah 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 disclaimer stuff. So don't take anything I say here as law. I just thought I would share my editing method because I feel like I found some techniques that really work well and I really like. They're just really like easy. They really make the editing process not so overwhelming, which I feel like it can be. It's kind of like daunting to have to go in and edit an entire novel. It's just like a lot. It's just a lot. Yeah, I feel like I found some techniques that make it easier, simplify it, help me kind of break it down into more bite-sized chunks. Yeah, I have edited 2 full-length novels with this method and I really like it, so just thought I would share it today. Another little disclaimer is that I write a lot of outlines, like even before we're getting into the first draft. I do a thought dump, I do my plotting wall that I've done a whole tutorial on here, then I do an outline, and then I do a zero draft, and then I do a first draft. So for me, a lot of plot edits and developmental edits happen in those stages when I'm like working through the plot. If you are somebody who doesn't plot as much, your book might need more developmental edits than the method I'm going to talk about today, but yeah, that goes back to everyone's book is different, so take with a grain of salt. If you want to try any of these techniques out, feel free. I really like them. So yeah, first step of my editing routine, I already kind of mentioned it, is I do a lot of plotting. For me, I'm counting this in the editing process because I work through a lot of plot holes and just any speed bumps, and I just work out all my pacing and everything during these stages. So for me, it saves a lot of heartache later down the road with editing, because in my opinion, it's a lot easier to edit a 30-page outline than it is to edit like a 100,000 word draft. Like it's just easier to move things around and add things the earlier on in the process you are. So I just wanted to include that sort of advice at the beginning. Is if you are writing a book that has a lot of world building, a really big plot, a really big concept, maybe multiple plots going at the same time, that's kind of why I do a lot of outlining. Is I just make sure that everything is flowing, because in the kinds of books that I write, there's usually multiple plots going on and then we all come together at the end, and I just like to really work through pacing, really work through the flow in the beginning stages, because it's just so much easier to fix. So if that sounds helpful for you, you can try that. Like I said, I have a whole video on my wall plotting method. If you haven't seen that already, you can check that out for a little more in depth of how I work through pacing and story arcs and all of that in these sort of early stages that just make it easier to do developmental edits. But yeah, just wanted to throw that kind of advice at the beginning, but let's get into my actual steps of when I sit down in front of a first draft, what do I do? Well, I just read it. My first step is read through your first draft. So very simple. And as you're reading through, get a notebook and kind of keep it next to you on your desk or whatever, or a separate document, whatever works for you. Keep like a blank page next to you. And as you are reading through, anything that pops out at you, write it down. I usually like to write, let me get a notebook. I got some examples. This is my edits for June Gloom. I'm gonna like hold it back here, so no spoilers. But basically, just sit with like a notebook next to you or a blank page, but for the sake of this example and what I do, I'm gonna say notebook. This is the first page that I would have in my notebook. It says first round. The stuff on this page is things that I thought of while I was writing the first draft, but instead of like halting the the progress that I was making and like going back, I just wrote it on here. So this is just anything that I noticed beforehand. So you can do that too as you're writing your first draft, instead of like going back and editing and like stopping the flow, kind of getting out of the groove of your first draft. You can just kind of write down some changes to make later. I find that eases my anxiety because I get kind of overwhelmed when I'm like, oh my god, I have to change all this stuff. I just am like, let's write it down and we'll change it later and just keep it pushing. So this is just stuff that I already wrote. And then basically what I do is I write down chapter, this is not really spoilers, so none of this is spoilers, so I think it's fine. I just say chapter 1, and then for me, this is, you don't have to do this at all. This is very unnecessary, but I like to write down what day it is in the novel, if that makes sense. Like, this is day 1, June 1st. So then, like, if we time skip, I can keep track of where we are in the calendar year and like how many days it's been since certain things happened. I don't know, I just like to keep track of it because sometimes I want to write a line that's like 2 weeks ago this happened, and I'm like, was it really 2 weeks ago? I don't know. So I keep track of my timeline, so I just kind of go through and make sure that the timeline adds up again, because I do it during outlining and zero drafting. I have a timeline with dates, even though I never really mention dates in my book. I just want to know where it is, like where we are in the calendar year, also for weather, for vibes, all of that, and just like as the story progresses, like how much time has passed and stuff. So yeah, I do it in the early outlining stages, but I just double check to make sure that I didn't mess it up in the first draft. Yeah, to prevent like confusion on time and stuff, I just keep track of the dates and the days, but you don't have to do that. Like down here we have chapter, what am I looking at? Okay, chapter 3 is on day 3, June 3rd, and chapter 4 is also on day 3 because it takes place on the same day, if that makes sense. So I'm tracking the days. And then we kind of skip here. Chapter 9 is on day 8, and then chapter 10 is on day 10. So I just like to keep track of how many days it's been, but you do not have to do that if you don't want to be that annoyingly extra. But yeah, so I write down chapter 1 and then timeline if you want to track it, and then I just write down anything that comes to mind while I'm reading. This includes lore. I like to write down anything that I like said about a character's backstory or just anything at all, so that if it comes back up later in the novel, I can make sure that the continuity is correct, like that the details are the same in both situations. So I just write that down to remember. I also like to write down questions. This is my favorite technique that I have tried while editing. I call it the question method. So original, but basically when there's a major plot point, I write down some question about it. Let me try to find an example. Okay, I can't find an example in the June Gloom papers, which is annoying, but let's just make one up. But I think I had one in my first novel that I edited. There was like a necklace that one of my characters was wearing, and so I wrote down, does this necklace ever come back up in the plot? Like, why did I mention this necklace? And then I read through the entire book, and then we'll get to this obviously, but for the sake of the example, I'm gonna kind of jump ahead, and I'm gonna say when I was reading through the edits and trying to answer any of the questions, I was like, oh, the necklace actually did never come back up, so I need to make sure that that does come back up. I hope that makes sense. Like, I write down any questions of like plot things and relevance things, and I make sure that every single thing that happens comes back around, is relevant, is a foreshadowing, or, you know, is beneficial to the plot in some way. And I do this in a questioning way. Like, I'll say, does the necklace come back up? Question mark. Oh, in for June Gloom, I would say the song that they sang on their first performance is called blah blah blah. Do I ever mention that song again? Like, just make sure. I just love writing down questions, and then later when you're done reading through the whole thing, you just have like a list of questions / lore you wrote down, all of that. Just, you can write down anything. And I just sort it by chapter, like I said. But when you're done, you can read through all your questions and answer them. And if they are unanswered, then you can fix them. And I feel like that's a really good way of finding plot holes, like accidental little things that you didn't mention again or like forgot about, because it happens. This is just a way to help find those little inconsistencies, and I like it because it's kind of thinking in reader brain, if that makes sense, because a reader would read about the necklace, if we're going to use that example, and be like, oh, I bet that necklace is going to come back up, and then when it doesn't, they're going to be disappointed or upset and like dissatisfied. Or with the song example, they're going to say, oh my gosh, I wonder if they'll record that song one day, or blah blah blah, like, and then it never comes back up. They're going to be like, what happened to that song? So I like the question method because it's very simple, it's very effective, and I feel like it solves a lot of like inconsistencies that readers would typically find. But yeah, I pretty much just write down lore, like I mentioned, like backstory, just to make sure that it's the same throughout the whole book in case I bring up the same lore again, just to make sure the details aren't changed. I write down anything that I want to change. If there's a scene that I'm reading through and I'm like, this isn't working, I'll write down, change the scene, or change the setting, change the dialogue, this scene isn't working, like just write something. And then obviously also the question method. So then at the end of reading your first draft, you'll just have a bunch of papers with questions, lore. You'll have a lot of papers with chapter sorted things. I can't think of a better word than things. You'll just have like a couple of pages that says chapter 1 blah blah blah, and then like things to remember, things to check, things to change, questions. And then my next step after that, after finishing your first draft read through and all of your questions and notes, oh my god, notes, that's a much better word than stuff. So yeah, once you finish that first round of notes, that first round of reading, you're gonna go through, and I like to start with questions. I answer all the questions, or if I can't, then I don't. And I'm like, we need to fix this. So then I make a separate note for that. But with all the other stuff that's not questions, just like lore and stuff, I make sure that it's consistent. And then I kind of cross it off if I don't need it. Like sometimes with the lore stuff, you'll write it down and then you'll realize that you actually did do it correctly, and then you just kind of wrote it down for no reason. But I feel like it's good to check. I feel like that's my worst fear, is like saying like, oh, this is how these two characters met, and then like 30 chapters later saying they met in a different way. I'm like, because I'm like, I know how my world works, I know my characters, I know their backstories, but it's like those little side plot backstories and little side plot things that I like feel like I get mixed up sometimes, because it just makes your world feel more consistent and real when everything lines up. Anyway, so you'll double check your lore, answer or don't answer or be unable to answer your questions, and then with anything that you want to fix, I like to organize anything that needs changed. I like to organize it into different sections of varying difficulty / intensity of how in-depth the edit is gonna be. So flip to the next page in your notebook, and I just write down quick changes, which is anything that's super fast. Like I accidentally changed a side character's eye color or something. That's a quick change to go into the sentence that I changed it and just type out a new color. That's a super quick change, but will make a big difference. So write down everything that's quick, and then I usually have a section for developmental edits, which is anything plot and like the bones of your story, anything you want to change in the plot, the structure, the arcs, the pacing. Write down anything there. Then I'll have a rewrites page where I kind of write down anything that fits under the category of a rewrite. Any scene that needs to be changed, anything that needs to be rewritten, updated, fleshed out more. And then I have a final page, if I'm remembering them all correctly, I have a final page called additions, which is like as I'm reading through, if I'm like, oh, I need to have another scene showing this to make this other scene be more of a payoff, I'll write down anything that I need to add. So it's like there's rewrites and then there's like additional writes of things we need to add. Everybody's notes are going to look different. Like you might not organize them into those exact sections, those exact groupings, but that's just kind of an idea of what I do, and I kind of organize them so it's just easier to breakdown. And it's like, we'll do all the quick changes first so we get in the editing zone, and then we'll do our developmentals so that when we do our rewrites and our additions, the plot is already fixed, if that makes sense. Like pacing and stuff is already fixed, so we don't have to additionally fix pacing and plotting on top of rewrites and additions, if that makes sense. I do my quick changes first because they're usually just little things like you said a character had long hair in one chapter and then you said they had short hair in another chapter and you're like, oh, oops. That's usually like continuity errors that just are just super fast to go in there and change. I do my quick changes first, then I do developmental, and then I do rewrites, and then I do additions. That's kind of the order of how I do it. You can do it however, but that's kind of how my brain works. And then once you have finished with all of your round 1 edits, you have finished your quick changes, finished your developmental edits, finished your rewrites, finished your additions, then you're gonna read through your draft again. Basically, to not be boring, I basically just do the whole thing over again. I write chapter 1, day whatever, and day whatever, date whatever, exactly like the first time, and I write down any new questions, any new things. For me, while I'm reading, sometimes if there is a new scene or a rewrite that I haven't really line edited yet, or like kind of, how do I say this? Like, okay, so we read our entire first draft already, but then when we add a scene, we're technically reading the first draft for the second time, but that scene for the first time. So sometimes I'll go over a rewrite or an addition, I'll read over it a couple of times and do a little bit of changing and, tweaking things just to make sure that those rewrites and additions get as much attention as the rest of the book, because sometimes I feel like I would fall guilty of being like, oh well, I rewrote that scene so the whole book is done, but it's like you didn't edit that scene yet, if that makes sense. So yeah, I basically just repeat the process of writing down lore, questions, blah blah blah, making sure everything is consistent, making sure everything is tight, making sure everything is how I want it. Overhaul wise, I just do that over and over and over until there are no questions, and you'll end up with these papers where it says chapter 1, chapter 2, and there'll just be nothing under it. And that's when you know that pretty much any actual story things are pretty good. I can't say perfect because sometimes you're gonna miss things, it's just human brain, but once you kind of have nothing that's bothering you, we can move on to the next step. And typically, I do like 3 to 4 rounds of reading and making notes, and by the 3rd or 4th, I'm not really coming up with anything. So once I can't really think of anything else that I need to change, need to tweak, need to fix, doesn't mean there's not anything to change, but that's what getting other people's eyes on it is for, but that's further down the line. But once I can't come up with any more notes, I move on to line editing, which is pretty much you go through sentence by sentence and make sure that it sounds the way you want it to. So the notes and the questions are to make sure that the story is good, and then I do the line editing to make sure that it sounds good, and the prose is good, and the sentence structure is good, and I'm saying things how I would ideally want to say them. Because sometimes in the first draft, you just write a sentence that's like a run-on sentence, and you're like, what is going on? Because you're just trying to get it out. And this line editing phase is when you kind of tweak all of that to be exactly how you want it to be, if that makes sense, like word for word. I don't really have a lot of line editing tips, but the only one I would say is read your book out loud. You kind of sound crazy, but it just helps you make sure that it's flowing, it's easy to read, easy to process. Like make sure that when you're describing things that it's easy to understand. When you are doing dialogue, make sure that it sounds natural, and kind of saying that out loud helps. And then also, I like to read myself out loud because if a line doesn't really sound like something that I would say, then I feel like it's not really true to my voice and my style. I want to change it into something a little bit more my style. I don't know if that applies to everyone, because if you are writing like a super prosy, prestigious, like dark academia fantasy, like, I don't know, I'm just making up something, then obviously the writing style would be different than your talking voice, I would think. But for me, I write like YA romance dramas, so if a line is ever like too serious, too detailed, too prosy, I'm like, this is not the vibe. It doesn't flow out of my mouth. It doesn't sound like something I would say, if that makes sense. And not that like every single line has to be something that you would say like to someone else or something, but it just doesn't sound like my style, if that makes sense. So I like to read it out loud for those reasons. Yeah, for line editing, you just kind of go through line by line, read it, make sure your paragraphs flow, all of that. And then once you're done line editing, which is another read through of your book, once you get to the end of that, I usually like to do one final read through where I just make sure that everything is perfect. All the notes, which includes notes, questions, lore, all of that, and the line editing. I just make sure that it's all how I want. And while I'm doing this, I also kind of try to read it from a reader's perspective. I mean, you can never really have a reader's perspective because you wrote it. There will never be like an element of surprise or anything. But I try to read it and be like, is this story enjoyable? Does it flow for a reader? Does it make sense? Like, I start kind of thinking like that instead of thinking in editing perfecting mode, if that makes sense. So yeah, I just like to do one more read through, and it's like at this point I've read my book like 7 times and I'm so bored of it, but just make sure that it flows and sounds good and stuff. And then my next step is to give it to someone else for a set of fresh eyes, see if they can come up with any notes that my brain kind of missed. I feel like I miss some things sometimes because I know all the lore of the world. So it's like when something is not explained clearly, I already know, my brain knows how to fill in the gaps. So I like to give it to someone who has never even heard of it before, doesn't know anything, someone who's not the writer, who doesn't know the lore of the world and everything, just to make sure that everything is clear. So for me, that person is my mom. I give all my books to my mom, the poor woman. Again, that does depend on the kind of books you write. If you are writing super spicy romance, I don't know if I would say give it to your mom, but whatever. Also, my mom is like, loves books, loves reading, and studied English in college. So she's kind of like a good person to catch just any grammar things that I miss, because I'm not good at grammar, but any grammar things that I missed, and also just as somebody who objectively can read the story without knowing all the things that I do, and I can just verify that it makes sense to somebody else. Like I said, giving your book to your mom might not be for everyone, so you can give it to writing friends if you have them, bring it to a writing group, bring it to even like friends who don't write and maybe don't read as much, because honestly, that's still good feedback too. This stuff is different from beta readers, which is my next step in the editing process, which we'll get into in a second. This is just new eyes to see if there's any holes and anything that you missed, and to see if someone else enjoys it, and to kind of talk about it with somebody else. Like, that's kind of the point of this. It's just like it's just this first little sprinkle of feedback. Do that with a person that you love and trust, and somebody that like roots for you, and like they want to enjoy the story, but they will be honest with you. Like, just pick someone who works best for you. And then if they have any feedback, any holes, anything, edit their feedback. You can organize it again into developmental, quicks, rewrites, additions, if they have that much to say. If not, just kind of have like a list of like, you know, I don't know, if they said like 5 things, just have a little list and then go through and change, if you want to. Because ultimately, like, I have read books where like I don't like a certain plot point or something, but I'm like, that if that's what the writer wanted to do, then they should do that. Like, that's opinion. So make sure that when people give you feedback, both family and friends in this sort of more low-key stage and also beta readers, make sure that you actually want to fix the things that they're bringing up. You know, like if they're like, oh, I don't like this plot point, or like this chapter was unnecessary, but you like the plot point, you think the chapter is necessary, then leave it. It's just to have new thoughts, new things to consider, new eyes on it. You don't have to take the feedback as law. So yeah, do your edits from your family, friends, feedback, and then the next step is beta readers, which is a little bit more, I don't want to say professional, but it's a little bit more like technical, instead of for like enjoyment purposes. I made an entire video on beta readers, where to find them, how to make it like an application, how to pick the best people, how to interact with them, what to ask for. So check out that video if you want to know more, but that is pretty much it for my editing routine. Once I do the beta readers, I apply their feedback, and then you kind of move into what the next phase of your book is, which is publishing or starting a new project or querying or self-publishing, whatever. Like, you kind of move away from the editing phase after the beta readers. That's what I do, at least. That's kind of it. Like I said, it's very simple. It sounds very simple, but I swear that you can like catch a lot of errors and a lot of things with a very simple method. Editing is like so daunting, and I just feel like the simpler that you can make it, why did I say it like that? Simpler. The more simple you can make it, the better. So yeah, I hope you enjoyed watching. I hope you try one of these techniques. I hope they help you. Please comment if you have any questions, either about what I said or any editing questions about your own process. If you have any editing hacks that make your process easier, please share with the class. I am always down to try something to make editing easier because it's horrible. And subscribe for more content like this. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope you have a really great day.